In our first level, we looked at auto levels, and now we're going to start to get into more sophisticated type of processes, actually relatively quick and fast, and you'll see the amazing results that we're going to wind up getting. I'm going to go back into my effects palette. You know, these expand and shrink down as we've kind of discussed before under the effects. I'm going to go into video effects. I'm going to wind up going to BCC, Boris Continuum Color and Tone. And I'm going to find my hue, saturation, lightness, and I'm going to drag it over into my effects plane. As part of this, I can right click and cut it, and I can take that effect and drag it right onto the clip, which I'm working with. And within here, we're going to notice that within BCC, hue, saturation, lightness, you have a hue fine control, and I'm going to expand this out a little so we can see the full titles. Saturation, lightness, mix with original, and pixel chooser. So let's say I want to go to saturation, and I'll just kind of adjust this a little. Look what happens to that water. So once again, let's take this and turn it on and off once again. And the watercolor has changed amazing compared to what we had before. What happens is when I ramp up the saturation that high, look what's happened to the coral. It's unnatural. We're going, well, gee, how do we wind up just fixing the water and not affecting these coral items that I'm going to wind up addressing later? I'm just going to bring this saturation level back to 0. And of course, these go into the negative and also the positive, by the way. We're going to show you why we like Boris Continuum Complete so much. Down in this area, they have what's called a pixel chooser. And a pixel chooser is where we're only going to affect a certain part of the screen or certain pixels that are in there. I'm going to come along here and I'm going to choose View My Chosen Pixel. Anything which is in white means those pixels have been chosen to be affected. Right now, the whole screen is white. It means whatever I do to hue saturation under the saturation control, that affected everything in the screen we were doing. So once again, saturation, it's affecting the water and also the coral. And we talked about that we don't want that. We'll just turn around and wind up setting this back to 0. We'll go back into our pixel chooser and we're going to go back into the view chosen pixels. And then I click on this little down arrow, which is for the pixel chooser. And you have all sorts of things you can do. You can draw rectangles, outside ovals. You can put it on the screen to only affect those particular pixels. The key to this whole thing is this channel control. Let's go down in here. The channel control has all sorts of things. Luma, red, green, and blue, our RGB spectrum. And these are really important. You can play around with all these different type of things in here. For the water, which is only one I want to change right now, I'm going to select the blue spectrum. And what happens is it starts to create this white and black matte. Any pixels which are in black means they're not going to be affected when we wind up doing these dials. Anything that's in white is going to be affected. If we have it on none, it affects every single pixel in there. And as we saw when we started to do the saturation controls, it affected everything across the entire screen. But I'm going to restrict it to blue because I want to affect the water. And we all know we're filming underwater, which is a blue environment. If you were in something like California, you may restrict it to green because the water there really isn't all that great. I'm going to restrict it to blue because I film in the Caribbean. They have a control here right down below that, which is called levels. Levels allows you to adjust this matte. So I'm going to come in and pick threshold. The threshold, then I wind up clicking on this little down arrow here under the black threshold. And as I move this slider to the right, look what happens. And I can put it in numerical value. Anything which is in black is not going to be affected, and whatever is in white is going to be affected. I move this slider until I try to get a really good separation between the water, which is now in white, and the coral, because what's ever here in the coral, when we wind up moving those sliders as part of this effect, it's not going to have effect. So I kind of move it until I start to get what's called leakage. And leakage is right down here. You see this? Now we're starting to affect the water. And if I push this slider even more, we can see the leakage gets even more. And look what happens here. Now we have blackness that we're not going to affect all the pixels in the water. So I kind of tone this thing down. I try to get it where it's a really somewhat sharper delineation. You aren't going to be able to get it the whole way. And as we talked about in the book, that Boris is really good up to a certain limit as far as the number of pixels, pixelation, color leakage. Once you have these mats, you take your scroller and you scroll along and you start to look and you see whether or not that you have effects going on where you're getting leakage in a scene that you don't really want. Here, you notice I had a little bit of leakage showed up. So I can hit on my little splice tool and do the shift key, and that's going to wind up splicing both of these clips at once. So and I'll go back to my arrow key. When I click on this, now I've created a second mat, which is in this particular piece of film, now the splice, and I can adjust my mat down because I had a little leakage, and now I have two mats that are somewhat adjusted, which are different from each other. That's the way that you can create multiple mats here. But the real key is that when I come in, because we're in view chosen pixel and I can turn it off, not affecting anything. When I come into my on, now what happens, I'm ready to start adjusting, and the only thing that's going to get adjusted is the blue spectrum. Now when I start to adjust my saturation, look what happens. I'm adjusting the blue as I slide it here, and there's no effect on the coral. And you have to be a little careful here, because the more you ramp up, you're going to get noise in the film, and we're going to talk about these later. But a good way to see how it does is to go to really these extremes, and you can go positive and negative. I ramp this thing up until I kind of get a tone of color in the water that I find appealing to me. This tone looks kind of good to me. I like it. It's 50, not a little too high. Let me bring it. I kind of like, let's go 40. Now let's take this and turn it off and look at that change in the color of the water. We haven't affected any coral, but we have changed the effect upon the water. It's amazing, isn't it? It's just really, really wonderful. Now you can start coming in and adjusting some of these other controls, such as you. And in here, a lot, sometimes I may ramp this up to like 2 or 3 to darken it a little. My U fine control, I usually put that a little in the negative, but can adjust it around. You're seeing what's happening to the water, that you can adjust the lightness. In this particular control, you can go both to the positive and negative. Usually I don't really adjust this control. And then you can do what's called a mix with original, that what it'll do is it does kind of like a 50-50 mix. This is one of the things in our first introduction, the matting, about how we use mats to only affect a certain part of the screen. And in this particular case, we affected the water. If we go over to the second clip, we go to on to look at our pixels, the control movement we did over on the first clip where we split has not been affected. So I'm going to wind up just ramping this particular item, let's say up to a 40. In fact, I'll go back and look at my controls. So they're both on 40. So I'm set on this scene. Voila, we have some amazing watercolor. We did it. It's great. It's wonderful. I really like it. But let's take a look about how we can use this particular tool again to affect other items which are on here, because now we want to do something with our coral. If I come in the U saturation lightness and I start to now not have a matte, and I adjust my U, coming in and I can do a slight adjustment, particularly down here, and I'm ramping up my saturation a little, so I'm doing some effects at this point in time to my coral. My water's staying relatively the same. Now I'm saturating the coral. That's one technique that you can use. First correct your water and then come in and do a slight correction, not using a mat to wind up affecting the coral. So once again, let's go turn all of our stuff off. And wow, this is where we originally started with the film. This is with auto levels. This is with correcting the watercolor. This is with doing a little particular change on the coral. I think that was kind of our first overall quickie lesson about what we're kind of doing here. Let's take this thing a step further regarding the BCC hue saturation lightness, and let's go back and talk about mats again. And in here, once again, that we're affecting the entire area, we'll go back to Pixel Chooser again. This time, I'm going to wind up coming in and choosing a channel that I'm going to say I want to affect green. So I'm going to come in here, I'm going to do my greens, and once again, I'm going to go under this black threshold command, so I'm going to bring up that particular slider, and I'm going to slide this, and once again, you're seeing we're getting blacks. I think we're affecting too much. Let me go to red, try something a little different. I'm going to spread this out. I don't like the way that's going on. Let me go back to blue. Within here, we had a mat, so we're laying down a second color correction mat, and we're going to wind up, once again, ramping it up. And what they have down here is what's called the invert mat. So we're using that blue to do the separation, and we're going to use this invert mat. We click on it, and it reverses the mat. What that means is when I now go to do these ramp ups, I'm not going to affect the watercolor because I already affected it or cleaned it up the way I wanted it already. And I'm going to come into my on button again. Now look what happens when I wind up doing the saturation. Wow, I'm only affecting the coral and I'm not affecting the water. And that's one of the things before when we laid down this second one, that when we started doing these dial slides, that we were affecting the water, but now I'm only affecting the coral. We can turn around and use these controls to wind up doing these things, especially let's say that I'm bringing this hue fine control down a little, and look at the way those reds really come out. Oh, is that just, it's amazing. It really is. Every time I use these programs, and every time I go on a filming trip and I come back and bring film, I actually get better because I actually learn about these programs are so amazing that I just have another round of film that I go through and I start playing with them, and I'm just so pumped about it. We didn't use two mats originally. It took us a couple filming trips, and then through playing around with the programs as you gain more experience, I said, well, why don't we try a second mat and let's see what happens. And wow, look at that. And now let's go through and turn all of our controls off and go back to the original film and look at what we got. I'll turn on my auto levels. I'll go to my watercolor mat that I laid down under the BCC hue saturation lightness, and then on the one for the corals, and it doesn't even look like it's the same film. It's just really, really amazing. So I encourage all of you to try all these different color spaces that are here. I stay in the SHI. It works for me. But once again, like I said, the more I use these tools, the more I really explore. And think about, use the blue spectrum to first correct your water versus doing the whole thing overall, and then go in and create a second mat and use that invert command, as we saw before, invert mat command, and you're only going to wind up affecting the coral at that point. That's really lesson 2 about how we use saturation lightness. And one of the things I want you all to remember is that's why we like these Boris tools so much, is because they allow you to separate these items that you're looking at into different color spectrums. Now, of course, they have shapes that you can draw to just only affect the certain places, but I find it's relatively easy and quick to really do my film by laying down these different mats and not using the drawing tools. And you can go to Boris. They have extensive tutorial lessons on how to use these controls, including the drawing tools. And I encourage all of you to go see how they wind up using them. That is the end of our second lesson on BCCU saturation lightness, and we're going to move to the next lesson after this, which is color balance. So I'll see you all shortly.